evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to our annual Presidency Lecture Series. This is sponsored by the Department of Social Sciences and the Masonic Citizenship Institute. This evening we decided to hold this event in the library and make it a little bit more informal and interactive than we've done in the past couple of years where we've had it in Harrod Hall. But tonight what we're going to do is talk about the U.S. presidency as seen through the media, particularly newspapers and magazines. We have examples of newspapers from the late 1800s all the way up to 1986, all of which have focused somewhat on U.S. presidency issues or federal government issues, things that were at the time of extreme import to the nation. So after our distinguished panel shares their information and thoughts with all of you, then we're going to open it up for discussion. And I'd like for all of my students to listen carefully and be prepared to ask questions after they're finished. Thank you guys, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, first, on behalf of the Institute and everybody that represents the Institute, thank you all for coming tonight. And this is the third program that we've had in our series of presidential lectures. And appreciate the support that the community gives us. We hope that continue to provide programming that will be interesting to the community. Just a little bit about the collection that we've amassed here. The three of us, as well as some other people within the Institute, kind of came up with the idea we'd like to ask people to donate newspapers, media of various types that have significance related to various historical events. And we've been very fortunate. We've had a number of individuals who have been willing to donate some pieces to the Institute, and so this collection we're amassing, and we're in the process of continuing to do so. This represents only a small fraction of what we have. We have quite an extensive collection of different papers. And so we would like to just say at the outset that if anyone else is interested in donating anything that they may have, it would go to the Institute and will be made available for students and faculty to use for scholarly purposes. This is another, I think, important thing that the Institute can accomplish here at Allen. With that said, I introduce myself. I'm Dr. Aaron Mason. This is Professor J.W. Platt. This is Dr. Eric Schmaltz. And I'm a political scientist flanked by historians. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's where I'm at tonight. And we'll be presenting the program tonight. And what we're just going to basically do sort of informally, we have these arranged in chronological order from the oldest on my far right to the newest. This one is 1986, that one is 1793. And so what we're going to do is I'll make a few comments about certain papers, and then Professor Platt will make some comments. Dr. Schmaltz will make a few comments, and so that's how we'll proceed. I would also like to echo Dr. Decker's comments. One other person I'd like to recognize is Tracy Trixie, who's one of our alumni. Raise your hand, Tracy. Now, she's going to get up and say something for about 30 minutes. She doesn't like to speak, so okay. Just wanted to embarrass her a little bit. She had a huge hand in this because she helped to curate these papers in the sense of curating, in the sense of going through them and finding out what was in some of them. And some of the articles that I was not aware of that we're going to discuss tonight, she's brought to our attention. So she donated her own time. We greatly appreciate that. And so we just wanted to thank her for that. Thank you very much, Tracy. Okay, so I'll just kick it off here as we begin. The first paper on my far right, far end, is an August 26, 1793 edition of Dunlap's American Daily Advertiser. This was published in Philadelphia from about 1791 until I believe around 1795 or 96, somewhere there. It wasn't a long-lived paper, but it was sort of like a thrifty nickel, if you're familiar with that. Sort of like a circular. And it had a lot of sales in it, but it also had editorials and things like that. And as far as our interests here, there was a letter that was published by George Washington, which is extant over there. And it's from George Washington to General Joseph Bloomfield. And at the end of our program, we're going to try to save a lot of time for y'all to come up and take a look at them. And but basically, the letter is George Washington, as president, is acknowledging support for some of his foreign policies towards France. And I'd like Professor Platt to take over from there because he's read it already.
Well, just, first of all, something I want to mention on that paper that I think is very interesting is, here is the President of the United States publishing a letter in a newspaper, really a letter that's nothing more than a thank you to somebody who has written him and supported his foreign policy. I think that's kind of interesting. It kind of shows how small the country was in 1793, something that we wouldn't see now in the modern day with the country huge and the huge population. But you had a very tiny population up and down the Atlantic coast there, so small that the President of the United States would write a thank you in the paper. Now, without getting into great detail on it, 1793 here is the beginning of the second Washington administration. I believe this comes from August 1793. So he's just been back in office for what, like 4 or 5 months for his second term. And there's a lot of things going on that are really brand new to a brand new nation. The first time that they're having to deal with foreign policy, because Europe, we had the French Revolution in Europe, and the England and France have gone to war. They just got through chopping the head off of the royal family in France. They're busy eliminating the entire nobility, and so things are pretty dicey there. There's a war going on. Now, this is the first time the United States, brand new country, has had to face a war in Europe that threatened to come over into and affect us. So there's all kinds of things going on here. This war's going on. The French have sent a representative over that we know in our history is Citizenship, who's come over and he's trying to stir up people to support the alliance that the French had made way back in the Revolutionary War. Said, hey, now it's your turn. You're supposed to come and support us now. And Washington is opposed to that. And so all of these things are going on, questions now of neutrality. You've got two parties being formed. The Democratic-Republican Party is the party of Jefferson, and it supports the French. You have the Federalist Party, which is Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. It supports the English. So you've got all these things going on. And in the midst of this, it's important enough in a newspaper that a county in New Jersey has written a letter telling Washington, hey, we support what you're doing. And George Washington, as President of the United States, writes a thank you to it. I think it really is kind of interesting to me how intimate things were back at that point in time. We're used to bring a huge country, and we were a little bitty country at the time. You guys have anything else to add?
Just tie one other thing too with actually all the newspapers dealing with the presidency, that close relationship between the American population and the president. And again, even as we get larger, it's easier to identify one individual in office than a bunch of congressmen, congresswomen. I mean, hundreds of them now. It's easier to identify and kind of symbolize the country. But even as the country gets bigger, we can kind of project some of our concerns, fears, hopes, aspirations on that one individual. So here we have a nice intimate look at that. Later, as we go through these other papers too, to tie in with them, we'll have, of course, the president's assuming various responsibilities of going through certain traumas in the national psyche, but we identify looking at that president as a symbol of the country. So I think it's going to be interesting, the relationship with the press, the journalists, and the office of the presidency. But one of the things we mentioned too, in 1793, we have the reign of terror just kicking in, the French Revolution. And that was the year Britain did enter the war against France. And one thing I was going to mention too with that was the, as you said, the two-party system that was taking effect. It was ripping apart the cabinet eventually. Jefferson was the Secretary of State, initially pro-French. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, was pro-British.
which side do we take? France was still technically an ally of ours at the time, going back to the Revolutionary War. They're having a revolution just a few years after our own. We identify with them, we identify with the former home country, but we're still debating those issues today, right? Look at the Middle East. Do you support revolutions or not? Where does it go? Who replaces the old regime? Libya, Egypt, France. You know, we still debate those today. It's a lot of pressure for the presidency.
Very good. Okay, the second one, we're going to kind of jump a lot of time here. We'd love to have some more articles that kind of fill in the gaps here, but the next one, May 4th, 1882, from the New York Times, deals with President Chester A. Arthur, which of course everyone's always thinking about what Chester A. Arthur did.
He's the president?
Yeah, that's right. He's one of those lesser-known presidents. So leave it to Tracy to find something interesting about Chester A. Arthur, because I was really at a loss. She said there's something really interesting about Arthur, and I thought, what could possibly be interesting about Chester A. Arthur? Because the only reason he gets to be president is because Garfield is shot, right? America's favorite cat. Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. Some students might know him better as that, right? But Chester A. Arthur was actually president during some interesting times that we don't necessarily associate with the presidency. This one is dated May 4th, 1882. Now that's significant because the gunfight at the OK Corral occurred in October of 1881. And this particular article is the President of the United States, Chester A. Arthur, threatening to put the territory of Arizona under martial law because, as he says, the Arizona cowboy trouble has gotten out of hand. And of course, the term cowboy at that time was a derisive term. It was not something that, as we now today see as the brave, heroic American symbol. He was seen as a rowdy and as a product of something that had to be tamed in the Old West. And so Arthur, in that quick little statement, says, I'm considering putting the territory of Arizona under martial law, if I have to, because it's so lawless. And this was in reaction to the killing that was going on in places like Tombstone, Prescott, Whiskey Row, the famous place in Arizona. Arizona was a very lawless place this time. So, fortunately, we could say something interesting about the presidency of Chester A. Arthur. So that's that article. Anything to add, gentlemen? Okay. We have quite a few, so we'll try to keep moving here. The third one deals with George Washington, but requires some explanation. The date is May 9th, 1882, New York Times. What this is essentially an editorial about George Washington. And it's significant because Dr. Schmaltz made some good points about how things in the presidency that are old or new, right? Be it foreign policy, alliances, whatever. This particular article deals essentially with memory of our founding fathers. And we tend to idealize our founding fathers with good reason. They were great men. They were great men. They accomplished great things. But they weren't perfect. And sometimes we have perhaps a myopic perspective on them. And we, again, not to be disrespectful, we should honor them, we should revere them. They were great men. But let's listen to the founding fathers themselves speak about themselves. But first, talk about the article. The article is called A Rebuke from Washington. And it's a reprint of a letter that George Washington wrote in 1777 to a subordinate. And in the letter, Washington is the virtuous statesman. He is the selfless patriot who is suffering for the cause, which of course he did. All that's correct. But at the bottom of this letter that's reprinted, the editor then says, I wish we had presidents like this. Because now in 1882, our government is so corrupt and our presidents are so unlike the founding fathers. Okay, so it's the same thing we kind of do. It's kind of interesting to see how we kind of yearn for a time in which our leaders are virtuous. Well, they were doing the same thing in 1882. I just would like to read a little excerpt from this regarding this, and this is from a book called American Creation. It's really good by Joseph Ellis, who's a founding fathers historian. And he tells a story about when a young man tried to congratulate John Adams for, quote, belonging to a truly heroic generation. Adams felt, now this is in the 1820s, Adams is reflecting back on his own generation. He says, quote, I ought not to object to your reverence for your fathers, meaning those concerned with the direction of public affairs, but to tell you a very great secret, as far as I'm capable of comparing the merit of different periods, I have no reason to believe that we are better than you. And then he says, quote, we are beginning to forget that the patriots of former days were men like ourselves, and excuse me, this is his grandson Charles Adams saying, and we almost irrestricably led to ascribe to them in our imaginations certain gigantic proportions and superhuman qualities, without reflecting that this at once robs their character of consistency and their virtues of all merit. So, to sum it up, we're just saying that we tend to say, I wish we lived in those days when things were better. They were doing the same thing in 1882 with the president.
I believe that was the Gilded Age, is that right, Jay? The 1880s, 1890s, economic expansion, I guess the businesses were bigger than the government, very close relationship between business and government. And some have argued that the late 20th or early 1980s up through the 90s even, that boom period was kind of the second Gilded Age. I just want to go back to an earlier time. But as we find out, people were saying this 120 years ago.
So I think it's kind of also nice to know that we do reverence and revere our founders, but I think it's kind of nice to know that we can feel dissatisfaction with our leaders and know that other generations have done the same, and so, well, maybe we're not so off track. They were not as good as the founders, but the founders weren't perfect either. So, okay, moving forward then, the next one, July 1st, 1882, New York Times. This deals with the execution of Charles Guiteau, and I'd like JW to take this one.
Well, I don't know if his actual execution is that significant, but I think it does kind of lead in, we may want to just hold this for a bit, lead into the fact of presidential assassination having been a significant part in our history.
That he's assassinated Garfield.
Yeah, he assassinated Garfield. No real reason, just because he was a guy that wanted a political position he didn't get. So he assassinates the president. Something that I think we'll talk about a little more later on, because I kind of wanted to hone some of this for the Kennedy assassination paper there. But I was telling Aaron and Eric, we really, the United States, have assassinated more presidents than I believe any Latin American country has. Now, we normally have this image of all the lawlessness and the violence in Latin America, but amongst ones that I do know pretty well, Mexico has assassinated a candidate, assassinated a guy that had just gotten elected but hadn't taken office yet. But in general, they send their people into exile rather than kill them. Guatemala has assassinated one president. Costa Rica has never assassinated a president. So this is I don't know what this means, but I think it's just an interesting, as a Latin Americanist, I think it's interesting in that it points out that we've had some flaws here in how our system worked, right to the point of assassination 4 times of a guy who was our freely elected leader of our country. So anyway, we may talk a little more about that later on.
Moving on, and I would like to get up for this one because I want to make a point of the amount of ink that's devoted to this story. Is this the one? It should be this one. Yeah, if you look right here, this is the amount right here. Okay, this is the amount. This is Tuesday, July 18th, 1882. This is the obituary for Mary Lincoln. Now, with a former First Lady, you would assume that is on the front page. But this is how much room she gets. That's it. Charles Guiteau, the executioner of President Garfield, gets this whole paper. This entire thing is on Charles Guiteau. Mary Lincoln only gets this. And I say this with all due respect. Mary Lincoln, in the later days of her life, was not well respected. She had slipped into true insanity. At the death of her husband, of her children, she had suffered quite a bit, and she had a very sad end, basically. And I'll let you guys come up and read if you're interested, but I think just the very fact that the amount of ink that's actually devoted to a former First Lady shows, I think to an extent, the level of contempt that she perhaps was held by the press. Now, whether or not that's fair or not, I'll let other people decide. But that makes the point.
I might, just thinking of what you're saying, I might jump in just a minute. Also, I think you could interpret that as showing that in a republic with elected leaders, there is a tendency, there's 20 years or so in between there, I'm not sure what the date on that was, but there's nearly 20 years in between the assassination of Lincoln and the death of his wife. I'm not sure what the date was on that. But anyway, we move on to the next. Every 4 years we have an election. Every 4 or 8 years we change presidents. And so in that 20-year period, the death of Mary Lincoln was much less significant than what the currently elected presidents are doing. So I think you could say that in the system we have, we move on.
And yet, though, just to take the other side,
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt is the big cheese after he's president.
Yeah,
So
we're gonna talk about
we'll
that
talk
in a
about that
minute,
one,
yes.
though. But yeah, that's a fair point that we don't privilege the office over the individual, and that's certainly a hallmark of our system. No question.
Well, did she die back in the States? You had mentioned she was in Germany for a number of years after.
She died in Springfield.
She came back, yeah.
She died in Springfield, Illinois. Yeah, she lived abroad with her son, her one surviving son, who then, she had 2 surviving sons, and then he died quickly after coming back. And then Robert, by the way, it's interesting when you read that, Robert Lincoln, her son, who was the only one who survived to adulthood, is the Secretary of, is it War or State?
Secretary of War.
He's mentioned as the current Secretary of War, and that he will be attending his mother's funeral. And it's just so interesting how, despite the amount of time or amount of ink they devote to her, it's interesting reading the pictures of the wife of the former president, If they're speaking of Lincoln,
And not just any former president.
it's just President
This
Lincoln.
is Lincoln, the first president to be assassinated,
Exactly.
president through the Civil War. But in 20 years, it moved on.
That's correct. No question about that. I think it was easier to move on because it was Mary Lincoln.
It could,
Honestly,
I
and
understand that too.
It was, but yeah, that's a good point. Okay, moving on now. You need to do this one. Los Angeles Times, April 11th, 1910, which is this lower one right here, deals with pin shot.
Okay. Okay, the thing that I really like about this one, okay, there's no doubt that the press, in a representative democracy here, the press should have a somewhat contentious relationship with the president, with all of the elected leaders. I mean, it's just a thing that is necessary. It doesn't always work that way, but it is an important part of the ability to criticize, point out error, whatever, differences of opinion. Now, on the other hand, the press can at times go beyond that to the point of either accidentally or on purpose influencing events. Okay, just to try to make it short and sweet. Okay, back in the early part of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, along with Robert La Follette, were the real nucleus of a progressive wing in the Republican Party. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president really with another political assassination, the assassination of Kennedy. He's reelected, and then for whatever the reason might be, in 1908, Roosevelt said he wasn't going to run. And he said, but you should have elected my good friend here, William Howard Taft, and he's the guy I'm going to support. So Taft is elected in that 1908 election. So as soon as he's sworn in March of '09, Teddy Roosevelt says, hey, I'm going to do the right thing here. I'm going to leave the country. I'm going to go on a world tour. I'm going to get out of your way so that I don't, in any way detract from your being the president. So he takes off, goes on world tour. The only thing is, Teddy Roosevelt is colorful. He's fun. He's great press. He's always fantastic quotes. William Howard Taft is not. He's not colorful. He's not exciting. He is a great big guy with a great big ego. So anyway, the press follows Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt goes to Africa, shoots big game, and every day in the papers back in the States, they've sent back information, okay, Teddy's killed a lion, or he's killed an elephant, you know. So front page news, what a former president is doing on vacation. News ahead of what the President of the United States is doing. Now, over time, this causes Taft to start building up resentment for his friend, Teddy Roosevelt. So he does kind of start doing things just to try to jab at Teddy a little bit. Now, Teddy's over there killing animals in Africa. He's being wined and dined by the royalty of Europe, and he's really not trying to do this. It's just the nature of their personalities and the press's fascination with Teddy. So eventually, Taft has the perfect way to get at Teddy Roosevelt, his now former friend. So he finds an opportunity to fire a man named Gifford Pinchot. Now, Gifford Pinchot was a good friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. He was the head of the Forestry Division of the Interior Department. He had been a Roosevelt appointment. He was so popular and so colorful and everything. Incidentally, he was used as the model to create Smokey the Bear as the symbol of the Forestry Department. Gifford Pinchot was. So anyway, he finds the opportunity. He fires Gifford Pinchot because he knows that's really going to get at Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy's over in Europe. He gets mad when he reads about this, and he says, okay, I'm going back home. And, you know, they always say there's no worse enemies than two former friends, and that's what you have here. So in the long run, Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican Party. Woodrow Wilson becomes only the second Democrat to be elected since before the Civil War. So the press, in this case, not on purpose, but just because of the force they had, accidentally very much influenced the course of American politics through the teens. Not on purpose, but just because the press, even back in 1910, carried that type of force. Okay, so anyway.
Okay, moving on to the Des Moines Register of September 8, 1939. Which is, yeah, so Dr. Smalls will come now. We're gonna come back to this one a little bit. We'll save that one for the last, but go ahead.
September 8th, 1939, we're 1 week into World War II, Hitler's invasion of Poland, September 1st. And the cover of that one is Rush troops to halt the French. And of course, now the French and the British have joined in on Poland's side against Nazi Germany. Now, not a whole lot will go on in the Western Front until the spring of 1940. So we call the phony war, the Blitzkrieg. There's some artillery barraging and maneuvering and some naval encounters. But of course, on September 8th, a week into the war, of course, Poland's being rapidly overrun by the Nazis with their Blitzkrieg. We're not sure where things are going just yet. Of course, Hitler was gambling that at least the British wouldn't continue on the conflict. But at any rate, this is looking at the events now on the front page news of the Des Moines Register. And underneath the caption has Roosevelt seeks nation's reaction to the arms embargo. And basically we tried to pursue, kind of like what Washington did back in the 1790s, and his successors, was a policy of neutrality. We tried that in World War I, eventually got pulled in. He wants to avert a conflict. In fact, I remember seeing a very famous, you've seen this on YouTube too, Dr. Mason, of a letter that Roosevelt gave Hitler in the spring of 1939, a few months before the war started. And Roosevelt was pleading with Hitler to promise not to invade a whole list of countries, about 27 countries, which eventually ends up invading most of them anyway. And Hitler actually, it's actually a kind of a disturbing scene. He actually makes fun of the letter. And he creates a lot of laughter. He's just reading this long list of countries, Denmark and Iceland and everything else. At any rate, Roosevelt's kind of in a tight spot. I think he realizes the Nazi menace. I think he saw them as the greatest threat. He was generally acknowledging more so than Japan, as aggressive as Japan was at the time. And but at the same time, we're trying to steer a neutral course. I mean, the public was relatively isolation seen at this time. wants to steer clear of any entanglements, but he is partial to Britain. And just a few months after the outbreak of the war, in 1940, already Roosevelt's making some overtures to soon-to-be Prime Minister Winston Churchill. There's also, we have our first peacetime military draft by September of 1940. We have efforts for Lend-Lease to help Britain. It was, I think, approved in December of 40. By March of 41, we maneuvered in that direction. But I think Roosevelt's trying to steer a safe course. I think he realizes that this is going to be a real problem. Of course, the American public's going to have to kind of drag into this conflict sooner or later. And of course, Hitler gave us a real favor. He declared war on us on December 11th, 1941, after the Pearl Harbor incident, which is a big mistake that he would have made later. But this is an interesting look at the early days of this attempt at a neutral policy. And Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt in this case, is trying to gauge what the public's mood is. Obviously, it would take Pearl Harbor incident and Hitler's declaration of war to pull us in full steam. And this is in the early days of the conflict. This Des Moines Register series that we have on the collection is very interesting. There's a whole bunch of articles, not necessarily dealing with Roosevelt, but looking at just at the day-by-day progression of the first days of the conflict in 39, and diplomatic overtures leading up to the war, and then the first couple of weeks of the war. It must have been quite a barrage of events for people to handle. Of course, Roosevelt is also part of it. Everybody kind of just wanted to add to that. But it's a very, very interesting look at those early days.
Okay, we'll move on then to I'm sorry for those of y'all that are on this side, but this is the famous JFK Life magazine, and this is from 1963. It's from December of '63, so it's only a few weeks after the assassination. I don't know if we need to discuss it
I
further.
don't think there's much to discuss on it, other than I know there are some of you there who very much remember the Kennedy assassination as one of those events that all of us who were alive at the time remember in detail where you were and what you were doing and how you were. You're shaking your head back there. Do you want to jump in? Yeah, why don't you? Tell us, where were you? Where did you hear it? You were at school. How did you hear it? Did somebody come in and tell you? Yeah, that's the same way as I heard it too. What did you remember what they said? How much did they know about it at the time? You don't remember. Anybody else? I know there's a number of you that remember it.
I do.
Okay, what's your memory of it?
I was in the 3rd grade. I shouldn't date myself. Anyway, my teacher told us they didn't put it on the announcement, but we all put our heads down on our desks and just, kind of absorbed it until the school administration decided what they were going to do, and then they just sent us home.
What were your thoughts when you first heard it? Of course, you were a 3rd grader. I'll take you off the hook because I was a senior in high school, so don't feel bad that you were in the 3rd grade.
Well, I was very troubled by it because, civic education was a big part of elementary school in the 3rd grade, and that someone would do that to the president was very troubling to me. It was very personal.
Yeah, I remember my first thoughts were, gosh, I thought this was something they used to do way back many years ago. I didn't know we could still do those things, in modern civilized times. Anybody else? Who else remembers? You guys remember? Somebody jump up. Where were you?
I was at college in the fraternity house. It came in on the radio. Everybody had radio in their rooms. It was all broadcasting the same thing. And in those days, I was not a fan of his, but I wept.
It was traumatic, whether you favored him or not. It was very traumatic, the idea that, and that really says a lot of what we're talking about. That the president, elected official for a limited period of time, is, whether you agree with him or not, whether you have a personal dislike for him or not, none of that matters. The idea that somebody comes in and in a non-electoral way eliminates that president is Something else I think is kind of significant on this is the Kennedy assassination represented, as far as media goes, represented the first time that we've had 24-hour day news. And nobody was prepared to do it. Nobody even thought that was a possibility. But all of a sudden, because of the big, this being such a huge thing, and something that people were just glued on their televisions with, and television's big by the time you get to 1963. And for the first time, we had 24-hour day news, something we are so used to now. Sometimes you think, I gotta get off this channel, you know. But this was the first kind of spur-of-the-moment experiment with 24-hour day news.
For some of our reporters that became well known later on, like Dan Rather and others, that was kind of the first, I think, national
Yeah.
exposure. Cronkite had been around, but yet up since first being in the living room moment.
Dr. Red Duty, who treated Kennedy at the hospital. I don't know if you guys remember Dr. Red Duke that used to do a medical thing on one of the channels, I don't know which one it was, but he was the emergency room doctor.
Very good. Okay, well, we'll move on to even more controversial things. We'll move on to Richard Nixon. We couldn't do this without Richard Nixon. This is the Nixon Resigns paper, and I'm very proud of this one. It's not so old, but that's a really great journalistic representation of another traumatic moment, I think, in American history. Although it could have been more traumatic if he'd fought on, but a unique moment, yeah. And so we were little babies. We don't have anything good to say about this. JW lived through this, so we're going to let him explain what it was like to watch the president resign.
Well,
I've seen it in videos.
Well, with Richard Nixon, I guess, and I haven't really given much thought to what I'm going to say, but in the case of Richard Nixon, I think probably the thing that influenced how people felt the most was whether you were a Republican or Democrat. There was something about Richard Nixon you just didn't feel, he wasn't warm and fuzzy. You know, it wasn't like this was somebody who, whether you, even if you didn't like him, you might feel bad about it. You felt like this was historical. As a historian, I certainly felt that. But it wasn't really like somebody who was beloved is leaving. Now, I think that paper over there does illustrate too that nobody knew quite how to deal with this. This is the only time we've ever had a president resign. And it's, the paper struggles to figure out how you deal with this. It's something that the press, even though Watergate had been going on forever, it seemed like, now when you get to this point, they really don't know what to say. They do, like you say, a good job of covering it, but you can tell it's kind of a forced covering. You guys anybody have anything to add to that? A lot of us remember that.
Well, I'm just gonna add one comment. I was just a young pup at the time. Actually, I was living in Silver Spring, Maryland. My father just got a job as a legislative aide for a U.S. Senator from North Dakota. He came out just as the crisis reached the fever pitch. I remember my father talking about years later about there was a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement going on too. We never had anything like this happen. Of course, in August of '74 is when my dad started his job. That's when the resignation took place. So there was no reference point for them, members of that very clearly. Of course, the sad thing with Nixon, he's a very complex figure. You talk about a self-made man who worked hard. He did. He had a number of accomplishments we don't often associate with his presidency. Of course, then again, he's what one of my high school English teachers would call was a man with a lot of character flaws. The ancient Greeks would have a fascinating look at him with his flaws and his character, personality flaws. But he's a rather tragic figure in some cases. He sometimes was his own worst enemy. There were some real enemies of his who were quite relentless with him, but it tended to overshadow his other accomplishments, whether it was opening up China or. American Indian affairs. And he was a Quaker by background, I think that's part of his complexity, but they, again, these kinds of things overshadow him. He spent many years trying to rehabilitate his image, and I guess the tragic thing. And also, he would have come clean and said, and not covered up what some of his associates had done. He might have come out looking a lot better, but he ended up covering it up.
If I can add something kind of following what you said briefly. I think this points out something that Nixon, and I always, just for my own amusement, I usually put titles on my lectures that I give. And I call, when I talk about this, I call it the Nixon tragedy, because it was a tragedy. But what, to me, it points out is, I doubt we ever had a president elected who was more qualified for the job than Richard Nixon. He had served as vice president, I mean, all the way he'd been in Congress, and his administration became a failure. Now, you can go back and point to a number of administrations who had complete lack of qualifications, and some of those did a pretty good job. Like we said last year, even though I have some differences with him, Harry Truman was very unqualified for the job. We mentioned, okay, but a number of people that sometimes people grow with the job, sometimes, like Nixon did, struggle with the job, and his personality defeated him in the end. But it says something about the office of the presidency, and honestly, I've never been able to quite put my hands around why this happens, but it does.
Sometimes our most qualified presidents, John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy
Horrible
Adams,
failure.
excellent example. Brilliant guy, probably the most brilliant intellect who's ever had as president. His presidency was really a failure. So,
Very good. Well, we're just going to keep using JW as our reference here because as we move on to the 1976 Wichita Eagle, the Carter-Ford debate, 76, and I would like to, and I don't know if this is the exact debate, but I would like you to discuss real quickly there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe.
well, I'll tell you something. I did not hear that debate because I was living in Central America.
Okay.
And we didn't happen to have it on the television then. So I've never heard that debate.
But you know the quote.
Yeah.
Yeah. When President Ford says there's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, despite the fact that the Warsaw Pact holds all of these poor countries by the throat, and the guy that asked the question, I show it in my presidency class, the famous video, when he says this, he just kind of stares with the camera. There's no Soviet domination, there will never be under a Ford administration. And the reporter, he kind of looks up and he says, excuse me, Mr. President, are you saying that the Soviets are not in Prague and in Warsaw and all these places? And he makes this clear, and then he continues to go on in this rambling, inane fashion of describing that they themselves do not feel dominated. Eastern Europeans, the Yugoslavians, the Czechs, the Poles, but that's an academic exercise, in all truth, they were dominated. And so it was an example of a smart man probably trying to be a little too smart.
Yeah, and it also really shows the power of media. The effect that one line, that one error had on the election.
It framed the debate at that point.
It framed the entire campaign. So,
Of course, Ford is also noteworthy by the first, I guess, a non-elected president. He was the second vice president for Nixon, just had a constitutional amendment process. Luckily, we got in by 73.
Came in under one of the daylight
Yeah,
circumstances.
and but he was one of those short-lived presidencies. But he, again, he kind of comes across as kind of bumbling and so forth. But again, I think physically, the injuries from his college football days, he had knee injuries and falling out. There's always the wrong image, Yeah, they're probably the best athletes, so he was actually
Considered the University of Michigan.
Yeah, the reality was different, but of course, how the images caught him.
And my first impression of Jerry Ford growing up, just a few years after this, was watching Chevy Chase play him on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
When he would bump into his stuffed dog there, and It's,
Talking stuff.
it's very funny, but it really wasn't fair. Of course, the highlight reels always show President Ford slipping down Air Force One.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but you're right. That's again, that's the power of the media to kind of focus on those things. All right, real quickly, then the Wichita Eagle, the Wichita Eagle Beacon of 1981, March 30th of 1981, the Reagan assassination.
Now, I remember that when I was in third grade, and of course we continued to have
Tenth.
class.
Sorry. I said assassination.
Yeah.
Forgive me, it's 10. I haven't read the article all the way, so I don't know how to do
That was when
Thank you, sir. At 10, go ahead.
Now, I guess that was our kind of Kennedy. We did live. Yes.
It's your
Yeah.
right.
I remember that third grade, and that was kind of a shock too. Because I remember the Kennedy mystique was already built in. But I thought, well, we have maybe another case like this. But I was only in third grade, but I remember the teacher came in or the principal announced it. Continued on with class, then we went home and watched the TV and so forth. And of course, they had the live film footage too. And of course, the Secret Service agent, that picture that's not showing coming out, the hotel where he was at. It's only about 2 months into his presidency. That was kind of a shock, I remember. He was really the first president I remember, maybe a little bit with Carter, I remember. And so, just a couple months in. And of course, we had been kind of, it had been kind of an exciting month because we had the first shuttle launch that month, March of 81. Of course, that program's shutting down now for the year, we're getting old. But then all of a sudden we have something on the negative side like that. So I remember that very clearly, both watching the shuttle launch and clearly watching the footage of the Reagan assassination. And of course, he was our oldest president. He was already 69 years old. But he came out rather. Yeah. Attempted assassination, excuse me. Yeah, we think it correctly.
I think maybe I overstated that earlier.
But the attempted,
We've assassinated several elections.
Watch it over. But he was 69 years old at the time, too. He was our oldest elected president. So he was a very vigorous man for his age, and remarkably came out as well as he did. And of course, I remember the scene with Alexander Haig. I think it was the Secretary of State. He was a four-star general, what have you. He says, I am now in command. Although really technically he was the vice president.
Everyone's dropping their constitutions and their 25th Amendment.
I think he was meant to reassure that he was in the hospital, that cabinet would continue on. And of course, this is during a time of heightened tensions too, with the Soviet Union, Cold War was resuming again. So this was kind of a very tense period as well. But then we found out, and of course, this only came just a few months after the Reagan assassination, John Lennon, December 8th. And again, in both of these cases, they had two very troubled young men. I remember just being a few months earlier, and so you have kind of a parallel.
There's the Pope, there's an assassination attempt.
Later that
On Pope John Paul.
the 81 or 80.
81 or 82, it's really close though.
It might have been 81. So we've had a number of really very, very powerful
And,
incidents.
there's actually some really interesting literature on this now. President Reagan and Pope John Paul actually began a correspondence with each other in the wake of that, and they believed that they had been spared by Providence, and they formed a relatively close association with each other.
What was that one story about Reagan was at the hospital?
Oh, yeah. Well, just real quickly, yeah, I think you talk about the image, you made the point about the media, there were these photos. Reagan insisted on walking into the emergency room and he collapsed. And the story was related later by Haig by one of his aides that he as he was being wheeled into the operating room, they said, Mr. President, we're going to sedate you. He said, I sure hope all of you guys are Republicans. and then the doctor said, today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans. Kind of like the old, we're all Federalists, Tubman and Jefferson. So, and thank God they had good surgeons that knew what they were doing, and things worked out well. It was just an attempt. You're right. That's going to be the word of the week for me, is attempt. Okay. And then finally, we'll have two more, but I'll just say this one very quickly. The shuttle tragedy in 1986, we have an article there of President Reagan giving his condolences and providing leadership for the country. The United States will remain dominant space power and all of that. And so that's one that a lot of people here can identify with.
Again, the president kind of steps up, to play,
Yeah.
kind of express the sentiments.
Yeah, again, that head of state role, ceremonial role. Okay. And then the final one, and I will just get out of the way here because this will be the wrap up, but I let you gentlemen remain seated.
Oh, we have to John Glenn on.
Oh, we didn't do John, I'm sorry, we didn't do John
Well, we
Glenn.
can start with that one because that ties in with the questions.
Yeah, well, actually, do you want to just take that real quickly, one of you
Oh,
guys?
very
I'll just
quickly.
go.
Actually, these two are interesting because they refer to, in both cases, well, at least the background is the Russians, right, the Soviets. To the left here, we have John Glenn orbits 3 times, back in excellent shape. That's from April of 1962. In the heyday of the New York Yankees, I might add. In any case, John Glenn, of course, was a Marine pilot, hero, Korean War, highly decorated. He became one of our first astronauts. This is in celebration or commemoration of his orbiting the Earth 3 times. He's our first, he's able to orbit 3 times around the globe. Very successful mission, and came back safely. This is, of course, the backdrop is to this is the Cold War, the Soviet Union. And it's both ideological. I think it also ties in with nationalism, national pride. And of course, the Soviets at this time in the early 60s were still maybe even slightly ahead of us in the space program. They already had launched the first artificial satellite in 1957, Sputnik, which was fellow traveler. It took us another year to get a satellite. I think it was Explorer 1, Explorer 2 in 1958. We kept watching these rockets exploding, but we're never going to catch up with the Soviets. One reason why the Soviets were a little bit more advanced, certainly we both took the German Nazi scientists, as many as we could on both sides, but the Russians tend to push their program. They basically had their engineers working, I'm going to say under armed guard, but they were pushing these guys. And so sometimes I think they kind of cut some corners. So initially they had the advantage. They put a lot of resources into that. They had the first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961. In 1963, they had the first female astronaut. They bring lots of dogs and other animals into space that had no prospects of getting home alive, but then they would orbit the Earth. And of course, we finally got our first guy up here, one of our first fellows up here in 1962. I don't think he was the first one up here. They had 2 before him. They didn't orbit though. Yeah, that's the distinction we want to make. So he does 3 orbits, which is a relatively quick journey, but again, that's the first real mark of success. Of course, Glenn himself will later have a long political career as a senator, tried running for president at least on one occasion. But there's a little thank you letter in the bottom corner here, President Kennedy, President's thank you note. So it's kind of like the Washington thank you note at this time. And of course, thank you to John Glenn, and of course this is in the context of the space race, right? Eventually the man of the moon, eventually Kennedy's calls on doing that, the Nixon administration. But at any rate, no, this was an evenly split competition up until about the mid-60s, and we began to pull away from the Soviet space program. And in the late 60s, we had a man on the moon. So for this time, though, it was a very, very close competition. One thing I should add, though, because I am German from Russia, I have to admit there was one of the Soviet engineers, highly decorated Soviet engineer. He was in a labor camp as a kid in the 1940s and 50s. He was brought out of exile. He was a highly prominent Soviet scientist that was associated with the Soviet space program. He was an ethnic German. He was highly decorated. Very tragic life, but later was redeemed in the space program. So he's part of that space race there.
Now our final one that we're also very proud of is original. It's the Alvin Daily Pioneer from 1919. And if you look, what's really interesting about this, when you look at the top, it has a picture of the old castle. And it says Northwestern State Normal, Alva home at the Northwestern State Normal College. So we're very proud of that one. Dr. Decker had that especially framed, and so that was as a place of honor in our institute. But Dr. Schmaltz will tell you how it relates to the presidency.
Well, we do have the presidency.
Yeah, sort of.
Maybe. There's actually an interesting article up here. It's a letter from a GI, actually it's a GI, from a U.S. soldier, Army soldier, writing from Russia. He's up in Archangel in the Arctic Circle. This is from April 1919. So we got our Soviet-Russian connection here. And he's talking about being the land of the Bolsheviks. We just had the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917, just a couple of years earlier. A lot of Americans don't recall today, but we had Allied intervention in the Russian, right at the end of the Bolshevik Revolution and during early Russian Civil War period, we had Allied intervention with the British, the French, the Americans, even the Japanese in the Far East. We had a number of troops stationed in the Arctic Circle, near Archangels. I think they were trying to secure military provisions that we had given Russia when they were our ally during World War I. And the Bolsheviks had pulled Russia out of the war. And so we were concerned about the Bolsheviks getting hold of some of these military supplies. And also we're trying ultimately to overthrow that regime. And the Russians will not forget that, by the way. We lost 118 servicemen between 1918 and 1920. We don't often know that, but that's what happened to this Allied invasion. This young local boy is writing back about his time in the land of Bolsheviks.
Let's see.
He's with the American Expeditionary Force. He's actually in Siberia right now, March 12th, 1919. Yeah, Fulton, F-U-L-T-O-N.
Roy Fulton.
Writing from the land of Bolshevism. So it's just kind of talking about saying hi to folks and what's going on there in Russia. Particular Russian connection. So that was
We
kind of
actually had troops in Russia clear up until the summer of 20.
Yeah, 20. That's
Just
correct.
just before the election of the fall of 20.
So it was like a 2-year intervention, maybe even a little longer than that. Of course, you get your new laptop here, nice typewriter, manual typewriter right here, but I always technology. Now this paper ran from what, 19?
Well, it goes through a
Very short-lived paper.
a succession of papers, and this one is 19.
I think it continued maybe for many years.
Yeah, 1925.
So this is near the tail end of it, but it's got, you know,
I love it because it has the old castle on it. That's really, gives a lot of character. I think, with the character.
So there's no president per se, but it does deal with foreign policy issues, and it does touch Northwest Oklahoma.
That's it. Dr. Decker, would you like to say anything in conclusion? Or?
First of all of this information is readily available, and we encourage students and faculty and community members to come up at any time and just give us a call or stop us in the hall, and we'll let you into the Institute to take a look at these things. But the thing about it that I think we wanted to really demonstrate tonight was the fact that this is national history, international history. It's here at your fingertips, basically, and the guys have done a great job of showing how world events, national events, have reflected here at home, and how some of the events that have occurred in our past have touched people's lives relatively personally. So I think now we need to just kind of talk about some of these things, and perhaps some of the younger ones might want to ask some questions.
I was going to add one thing too. I think we'll have the display up for maybe another couple of weeks or
Sure.
so. So there's
Yeah.
an opportunity to take a closer look at the items we mentioned, plus some of the other side articles to get a feel for that. Yeah, how to explain that? A number of sources actually, some that we know, some that we don't know as well, but these were donated for use by us. A handful came from a colleague of my father's, so I was allowed to borrow those. Actually, the Des Moines Register ones were those of my dad's colleague. My dad taught at community college for a number of years. Back in the late 80s, one of the men who hired him, who taught for a couple more years, that shows you how many years ago this was. This guy was a World War II veteran. He's still in his early 60s. He was a geography instructor, got a PhD in the GI Bill. He was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. He was from the Des Moines area. And apparently he must have been collecting some of these newspapers while he was in high school or junior high. And then a few years later, he'll be actually in Western Europe. He fought the front lines and suffered frostbite. After the war, he goes back and gets his education. He was still teaching until 1990, so that was one of my dad's good colleagues. I think how that worked out is that he must have saved these over the years, being interested in history, and his wife was a retired administrator. I think she had donated those for my father who taught history then. So I was able to get some of those. But there are a few others that are donated that are from different sources, so colleagues, acquaintances.
Newspapers are an excellent source for history. They are something that historians use, maybe not for factual things, but for understanding how things fit within the context of the time. Because the newspapers will give you that, and give you a different view of it than what you might have from the perspective of the current day. So they are very important historical resources.
It's an old statement, journalism is the first rough draft of history.
Mhm.
It's really the beginnings of that. And in a way, they become primary sources themselves, so they become part of the eras in which they appear. And again, it's remarkable how well preserved some of these were.
I have a question. Will you be adding a 9/11?
We have some.
We have some
Yes, we
actually.
have some.
We have
And the
three.
impact on the book?
We have probably 5 or 6. I've got one from the Arizona Republic when I lived in Flagstaff. We've got a couple of those. So, but yeah, we have those. And again, if people would be interested in donating, again, this would be a collection that would benefit our students here. And things are, yeah, within the last 10 years, they'll be really important within the next 30 years, the next 60 years. So we'd like to establish something that when we're no longer here would be something that students can be using long after we're gone. So,
We actually maybe scan a few of the images
Yeah.
for future websites that we want to work on, so.
And there's something about having an actual thing to touch rather than microfilm that
Yeah.
makes an understanding of history and the context better. Because if you don't know something exists, you aren't going to go look for it. But if you see it, then the context starts to build. And probably a prime example that I could give some of you of how this happened for me was when I was working on my dissertation in the north Farmington, New Mexico. The only way that I could put together some of the information I needed was by going back through old newspapers, and spent days in a library, literally going through them. And then that gave me the context to go look at microfilm. And so sometimes you have to have this, and unfortunately, technology, I think, takes us away from this.
As I was reading the one here on Pinchot, Roosevelt, and Taft, as I was reading it, I was thinking, hey, I've been teaching this for a number of years, and I was thinking, hey, apparently I got it right when I was teaching it, because here it is, it verifies what I've been saying, so.
On the right track, that's right. That's right.
What I think we've talked about, we really hope is that we build up, that the Institute can build up a big enough collection of newspapers and have it organized in a location where it can be accessed by students who are writing paper for Dr. Decker's research class, or a paper for any of our courses, or faculty who are researching something. I think that would be what we hope is the outcome of what we're working on.
Question?
Question?
Comment?
Did the media coverage of the Carter Ford debate really change the outcome of that election? Like, is Ford expected to win before he had to slip up in the debate?
Not necessarily, he wasn't necessarily expected to win. And, I don't want to overemphasize it because he was definitely behind at the time. But as you got toward the end of the last weeks of the election, it did tighten up a lot. I don't think that was the final, the thing that made that election was the Watergate scandal and the things in the Nixon administration that really Ford had, at least image-wise, had inherited. And of course, he pardoned Nixon. The pardon was a big political hot potato at the time. So I think he was probably destined to lose. But I think the real point is it completed the painting of an image of Ford as being kind of a bungler and so on, which I don't think is a fair image of him, but it really created that image, completed the image that was already kind of there.
One thing I was going to add about Ford, wasn't he on the Warren Commission?
Yes, he was.
Kennedy Assassination,
Yes, he
too,
was.
so those kind of these different characters, different events tying into the other two. Congress at the time.
But as time goes on, you start to see those debates, I think, take greater, they exert a greater impact on the outcome of elections. For example, it's anecdotal and we can't always prove it, although we can go back to opinion polls taken. And in the 84 debate with Reagan and Mondale, the seminal point was, you mentioned President Reagan was 68 when he was elected. He was 72 when he was running again in before. He had survived an assassination attempt, and there were already rumors that President Reagan was not quite up to the task mentally, that he was just simply too old. And of course, Mondale tries to exploit this. He doesn't actually say it, but he kind of hints at this in the debate. And Reagan comes out with one of his great zingers, and he says, well, I will not make age an issue in this campaign. I am not going to, for political purposes, exploit the youth and inexperience of my opponent. So this is a 72-year-old guy zipping that out. And I've heard I've read a lot of people that said at that moment the debate was not only over, the election was nearly over. And that was one of, I think, two or three that they carried out. So, again, like JW said, the power of the media, and that's image. And then, of course, Reagan's also was well, there you go again. There you go again. Just the way a guy would, he's in a bar and he would say, he's losing an argument. He just, well, there you go again. It doesn't really mean anything, but it sounds urbane and it sounds to the point, and people like that. And it resonates with the American people.
That happened with the Nixon Kennedy, right? Basically, if you listen to the radio, if you listen to that,
Yeah.
Nixon might have won, but the visuals, of course,
That first debate where Nixon refused to wear makeup and such, and he looked really bad.
Yeah.
And people that listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon had won the whole show, and people that watched it on television all felt that Kennedy won. So,
And that's a fantastic, because that's when TV's really coming into
first
town.
time there'd
First
ever
time.
been
And they had all these rules that the Kennedy and Nixon people had agreed upon, and one of the rules was that they would have to stand behind a podium and not sit. Although they were allowed to sit, but when they spoke, they had to stand. And the reason why the Kennedy people did that was because Nixon had suffered a knee injury, and they knew that it was difficult for him to stand for long periods of time. And when you watch the video, when he gets up and stands, he shifts his weight on his right knee, and he looks shifty. He looks uncomfortable. He looks shifty, and he just, fair or not, he gives off this persona that he's untrustworthy.
I wonder if it's also true on that. I've never heard that, but I wonder if it's also true that with Kennedy's back problems, he needed to stand up every once in a while.
Probably so. The Kennedy people insisted on it, so it must have been. So
That was part of it.
you're trying to exploit, and that's fair. I mean, you're trying to exploit the advantages and the weaknesses of maximize your advantages and his weaknesses.
Other comments or questions? Okay, I think this will conclude our annual lecture, and we appreciate everyone coming out tonight and hope that you gained something from the experience. And again, we welcome any of you to visit the Institute's archives as they're growing, and certainly would appreciate additional contributions to that. So with that, we're finished. Thank you.
Well, he survived the flight real easily. The re-entry and then the time in the water. Real dangerous part. They were. Say, remember when Pastor Burton, you could see even the plane was so hot. And of course, we didn't, wish we had a newspaper on that, but we had to look in on that, down on Roosevelt, on Steve dedicated Jesse Nutt.
I remember Nixon signing it very
On the glass like.
only because
Really
the reason I think I remember so
Really
well, my
is
dad was an ardent
local
Democrat.
to the university.
Turkey Nick's gone.
He's
He
glad he's gone.
He was
I think a lot of
celebrating.
Republicans were glad that he was finally gone. Like, oh, geez, it's behind us.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.